After we realize that there's a first resurrection and it's non-physical and it's victory over sin, whereas our enemies are sin and death, we've got victory over sin. We realize that John chapter 5, verses 24 to 27 are talking about the first resurrection, but the second one is in 5 verses 28 and 29. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice and shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. Notice that the first resurrection doesn't include unbelievers like the second resurrection does. Now, the second resurrection for unbelievers is not seeing them come into a good thing. For unbelievers, it doesn't say they're going into life. It says they're going to come forth in a resurrection of damnation. And that's what's going to happen to sinners at the second resurrection. But what's going to happen to saints at the second resurrection is what you see outlined in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, the saints are only discussed in 1 Corinthians 15, not the unbelievers. The unbelievers are going to resurrect, but it's going to be a resurrection of damnation for them physically, but it's going to be a resurrection of life for us physically. Now, why is the second resurrection being referred to in John chapter 5, verses 28 to 29? It's because 1 Corinthians 15 and 23 and John 5, 28 and 29 is a resurrection of the body, and that is the second resurrection. So here we have the first resurrection, every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits. When Christ actually physically resurrected, we count that as our resurrection because that saves us. So that's the first resurrection referring to salvation. Afterward, they that are Christ said is coming. It's outlined in a different color to distinguish it from the first resurrection because it's physical and it's going to happen at his coming. Now, verse 24 says that when this point comes at his coming, the end occurs. Jesus delivers up the kingdom to the Father. And when he has put down all authority and all power and all rule. Now, the one who puts down all rule and all authority and power is God the Father. And you might just look at the pronoun he. And you might say, well, we need to be consistent with the he because in the first instance, it's mentioned in this verse, he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father. When he, making a mistake and thinking it's the same he, which is referring to Jesus Christ the Son, has put down all rule and all authority and power. But the second instance of he is not referring to the same he in the first instance. The second one is referring to God, even the Father. The reason I know that is because Paul was basing all of his understanding here, including especially verse 25, when he said he must reign till he hath put all enemies under his feet. He's basing that all on Psalm 110, verse 1. And the Bible distinctly tells us there that the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Father is speaking to David's Lord, which is the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And he's telling the Son to sit at the Father's right hand until the Father, I is referring to the Father because the Father is speaking, until I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and he said, he delivers up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he has put down all rule and all authority and power, we know it's talking about the Father. After the Father puts down all rule and all authority and all power, as we read about here, until I make your enemies your footstool. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, tells us what the last enemy is that goes under Jesus' feet. He's been sitting at the right hand until he makes his enemies his footstool. For that reason, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that he must reign until he hath put all enemies under his feet. In Psalms, where he sits until all enemies under his feet, 1 Corinthians 15 and 25 says he reigns until all enemies are under his feet. That tells us that he's sitting in a rulership right now. This is a current, right now rulership. Because when this mortality puts on immortality, according to 1 Corinthians 15, then it's Christ at his coming, the second resurrection, which is physical. At that point, the end comes. Look at it carefully. Afterward, they that are Christ at his coming, then cometh the end. Then is when he stops ruling because he rules until he put all enemies under his feet. And then when that point comes and the end comes, the until point arrives, he delivers up the kingdom to God. And Paul interprets that as Jesus reigns until. And so if he delivers up the kingdom to God, even the Father, after the Father put everything down under his feet, Jesus Christ has ruled or reigned till all enemies were under his feet. And the last one is death. Hallelujah. So when verse 26 says the last enemy is death, this isn't talking about spiritual death. We got victory over spiritual death all during this time that Jesus has been sitting on the throne up in glory. When we got saved, we got victory over spiritual death, and we maintain that victory by continuing to live a resurrected life and kill sin instead of sin killing us like it killed Paul when Paul committed sin. And so verse 24 parallels verse 28. When verse 24 says, the end comes, Jesus delivers up the kingdom to the Father after the Father's put all rule and all authority and power under Jesus' feet. Verse 28 says, when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. When God puts everything in subjection to the Son, he subdues everything, even death. And the Son becomes subject and delivers the kingdom to God. And then verse 35 says, but some will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? Well, verse 36 says, thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened except it die. Now, in other words, you just said what body it was when you asked, how are the dead raised? As soon as you said raised, you gave your answer yourself, because he's saying what you sow. And it now brings us into another perspective of agriculture. When you sow something, it's agricultural language for sowing a seed. And what you sow is not quickened except it die. So the raising or the resurrecting has the key in it. You can't resurrect something unless it's already died. Resurrect comes from the root word resurge. And when something surges, it's alive. It surges with life. When it resurges, it surges a second time. Now, if something is already alive, it's already surging. It doesn't need to be resurged. It's already surging with life. But when it's resurged, something happened between the time in which it surged with life and the time in which it resurges. It died. So you can't see something quickened except it has died. So what was it about Paul that was surging with life when he wrote this? But it was going to surge again a second time because Paul put this resurrection in his future. What was it? Some people think it was the 70 AD resurrection, that a physical resurrection would not occur, but a non-physical one occurred. That doesn't make sense because Paul had already non-physically resurrected by the time he wrote this. He was saved. He was resurrected with Jesus in the first resurrection of salvation, and he was having victory over sin, which is the first resurrection. So there's something about Paul, and it couldn't be his soul or his spirit because his soul or spirit were already non-physically resurrected, that was going to die in the future. And that something was the same something that was going to live a second time. You see, when it says it dies, there's something about Paul that would die. And that same it would be quickened or resurged or resurrected, given life a second time. So the kind of body that they're going to come with has to be a body that has died after it had lived a mortal life and then lives a second time and resurges or is quickened. And quicken literally means to give life. It's given life a second time after it dies. So if this is talking about people that are saved and Christians, and they're going to have this mortality turned into immortality, they already had their soul and their spirits turned into immortality. It's their bodies. The only thing it could talk about was their body. Spiritually, non-physically, they were resurrected by being dead in trespasses and sins. So their spirits and souls aren't going to resurrect a second time If their soul or their spirit would die, it would die because of sin. If you're going to die again non-physically, that means you're going to sin. That means you're going to enter into Christ's death. You did that already when you were saved. So it's not talking about a non-physical death when it said it's not quickened except it die. The death that it has to die in order to be quickened and resurrected or resurged can only be a physical death. Let me explain that more in our next lesson, as we're now talking about the second resurrection.